Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, my name's Izzy and I collect cool to hot growing orchids here in my apartment in Sydney. Today I'd love to go through how I like to repot my Phalaenopsis orchids. I have just recently done a full basic care video on Phalaenopsis, so I'll link it in the description below and pop a link above if you'd like to check that one out. But today I'm just going to be showing you how I repot. The best time to repot a Phalaenopsis is generally just once it's finished blooming. Phalaenopsis generally have really long lasting flowers, so there's not particularly a certain time of year that's best to repot a Phalaenopsis. I normally just wait until the flowers are finishing, or if they really need to be repotted, for example if their roots are really struggling, or if you've recently just purchased one and it's just in sphagnum moss, I do still repot it even if it has a flower spike. Or if you need to save the orchid and the orchid itself isn't looking that healthy, I'll generally cut off the flower spike and repot it so it can then focus its energy on growth as opposed to flowering. So I have two Phalaenopsis orchids that I'm going to be repotting today. The first of which is my Phalaenopsis Mini Mark, which has slightly outgrown its pot, and it's still also in the potting medium that it was in from when it was a seedling, which I'd like to change. I always start by soaking each of my Phalaenopsis in just plain tap water for a couple of minutes to help soften up their roots away from the medium, so it's much easier to remove. Then while that's soaking, I just like to mix up my fresh potting medium, which for my Phalaenopsis I like to use a mixture of chunky bark, perlite and a little bit of sphagnum moss. This chunky bark I get from a garden centre in Sydney called Flower Power, but you can always purchase some nice chunky bark online or hopefully from orchid nurseries in your area. Once the orchid's had about 5 or 10 minutes of soaking time, I'll thoroughly drain it and then gently squeeze the edges of the pot just to loosen any of the roots away so it's easier to remove. Once I've successfully separated the orchid from its pot, I'll then gently remove any of the excess medium that's stuck to the roots and give them a thorough inspection and remove any of the dead or really unhealthy roots. It's generally pretty easy, particularly with Phalaenopsis, to be able to tell which of the roots are dead and which of the roots are still healthy. Dead or really unhealthy roots will be brown and squishy most of the time, and then healthy roots are either green if you've just soaked the orchid like I've done, or if they're aerial roots where you haven't soaked it, they'll be silvery and sometimes with an active root tip, which will be green on the end. If you do need to remove any roots, just be sure to sterilize your cutting implements with isopropyl alcohol before using them again between different orchids. Generally when I'm repotting orchids, I won't reuse the bark, as most of the time it is broken down into much smaller pieces than it once was. So here I'm just separating the scoria or the lava rock into the mix because that's still nice and chunky and reusable. Then I'll give it a little mix around just to make sure I'm happy with the ratio of the potting medium that I'll be using. And now it's time to pot it up. So you can see here the new pot that I've selected isn't actually too much bigger than the one it was in before. And don't forget, Phalaenopsis are epiphytes, so in nature they grow on trees, so they really don't want to be in a pot that's way too big for them because they won't be able to dry out fast enough and they'll be more prone to root rot. So here you can see I'm just slowly backfilling the pot. I've made sure that the base of the orchid is at the top of the pot without it being too deep or too high above the rim, and I'm doing my best to make sure that the medium I'm popping in is as evenly distributed as possible. You don't want huge clumps of perlite or huge clumps of sphagnum moss in one spot. You want it to be as even as you can get it. I'm also trying to ensure that there's not huge air gaps between the roots and the potting medium by gently tapping it on the table to encourage the medium to settle deeper into the pot. As phals do grow on trees in the wild, it is normal to have some of the roots that won't fit into the pot, but seeing as I'm potting these ones and not mounting them, I do try my best to fill it as close to the rim of the pot as possible without covering over any of the leaves, and as long as they're in a nice free draining and chunky mix, the more roots you can get into the pot, the better the hydration will be and the longer you'll be able to extend the time in between watering. The final little step before I'm finished is I just use a little garden stake as a little poker just to help fill in any of the gaps that I can see. That's also why it helps to use a clear pot, because you can actually see gaps further down into the pot that you might not normally be able to see if you're using terracotta or the normal black plastic pots. And there you have it, Mr. Phalaenopsis Mini Mark is repotted with a nice even distribution of medium. Alrighty, so now we'll move on to our second repot of the day. This one is a much trickier one as it's in a mesh pot, and as you can see, its roots have really overgrown its current size. The mesh pots were really good for starting out seedlings or helping to recover Phalaenopsis that have been struggling. However, as I've let it grow so healthy and strong, I've left this repot a little bit too long, and now it's going to be really tricky to get the orchid out. But I'll tackle this repot the same as I would any others. I start by soaking the orchid in tap water for a couple of minutes while I prepare the medium. I'm just going to add a little bit of extra bark and perlite to the mix just to make the consistency and the ratios a bit more to my liking. And once I'm happy after about 5 or 10 minutes that the roots and the medium are thoroughly soaked,
soaked, I'll remove it from the decorative pot and get started. So I did try to loosen up the roots by gently squeezing as I'd done on the last orchid, but this one was so tightly in and its roots were so wound through the mesh that didn't really do anything. And I just kind of had to accept that I was going to have to destroy this mesh pot in order to get the orchid out safely. If you are doing this yourself at home, please be careful with any sharp instruments or scissors that you don't cut yourself. I just very slowly and carefully went and cut each of the plastic segments in between the holes to carefully free up one root at a time. I found it quite a good strategy actually to just sort of eye off a part of the pot that you wanted to remove, like sections at a time. That way, once I was able to free up part of the plastic, I could also remove some bark along with it to see a bit more clearly where the roots were coming and going from. As much as you might like to, and as much as I was tempted here too, it's really important not to rush this process because you really don't want to break or cut away any of the new roots that your orchid's just spent all its time and energy growing, as it can jeopardize its health and cause the orchid to struggle a lot more once it's been repotted. They already suffer a little bit of stress when they're repotted anyway because their roots have been disturbed, so you don't want to disturb them any more than they have to be. But finally it came free of the mesh and I was really pleased to see that most of the roots that were inside the pot were nice and healthy. There was only a couple of dead squishy ones that I removed with some sterilized scissors. I also chose a nice clear plastic pot for this orchid, and as you can see, as compared to the mini mark, this one I potted up into quite a few sizes larger. This orchid, because there were so many roots that had been outside of the mesh pot, I'd been finding it wasn't really hydrating as well as I wanted it to, so I chose a pot where I could fit majority of those roots inside to help rehydrate it and make it a little bit more healthy than what it has been. Even though this pot is quite a bit larger than the one it came from, it is still quite nice and snug in there, which is good. It's just big enough that I can fit all the roots in, but the roots are still able to touch the edges of the pot and the base of the pot without it being too high or too low above or below the rim. Just as I mentioned with the mini marker repot, you want to make sure as best you can that the medium is as snug as possible against the roots and that there's no big air gaps. Just tap the pot lightly on the table to help them shuffle down to the bottom, or use a small garden stake or chopstick to help guide the smaller bits of medium around the roots. Just be really careful that you're not pressing too firmly, as that can sometimes cause the roots to break under the pressure. Once it's all nice and snug and comfy, then repot number 2 is complete. I'm really happy with how this one looks and I'm sure it will only get healthier. Anything that I have just repotted, I do like to water in with a weak dose of Seasol. This just helps them to settle into their new environment a little bit quicker, seeing as you have just stressed the roots. On the back of the bottle there isn't an orchid specific dose, but if you look on the back it does say fern and indoor plants, and for those it suggests about 20 mils of Seasol per 9 litres of water. I've got a 1.7 litre watering can, but I just fill it up to 1 litre and give it about 1.5 mil of Seasol. I then give them a really thorough soaking with the watering can, making sure to cover all the medium. Sometimes you do get a little bit of residual dirt and dust that might come off the bark or the perlite from the pot. Just make sure to rinse all of that out thoroughly, and I empty the full 1 litre that I've made up between both of these. Then I'll replace their name tags if they have any, and then I'll pop in one of my coloured watering tags so that I can remember which day I've last watered them. Feel free to check out my watering video for more information on how I use these. Once that's done, I'll just leave them to drain thoroughly and air out outside before I reunite them with the other phals on the shelves inside.
Alrighty guys, that's everything I've got for you today. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more of my orchid content. Pop a nice comment down below if you'd like to, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!